Okay, thank you. Here we go. Let me start sharing the screen. Yeah, I mean, I noticed the password for this meeting, that the verse contains the phrase "I create disaster." So I hope that doesn't portend to what I'm doing here. I mean, I'm introduced a little bit in the notes. I mean, I'm a pastor of Hope Church in Gravesend. It's a small Baptist church. I also work part-time for Biblical Creation Trust, which essentially is one of our sort of key things is to work with pastors and students. We're really wanting to sort of reshape the creation debate because we recognize it's not always done in the most helpful way. We want to make that something rather more fruitful. So hopefully that will come across in what I'm doing today. And I'm just grateful for those of you that have come along. It's a topic that I think people can be a little bit afraid of. I was talking to a student from Oak Hill last year, someone who actually has a degrees in geology is his background, and when I asked him how is this topic viewed in the church, because obviously I have my own view, but I'm sort of immersed in it all. You know, how do people see this? And he said, well, most people just don't think about it, and those that do feel terrified of it. I think if you're a leader in a church, you can feel very out of your depth on the scientific issues. Often there's people in your congregation that might know a lot more than you. You might also be afraid of the sort of division that can potentially be caused by this. It does arouse very strong reactions on both sides, and almost whatever you say, you're going to get it in the neck from someone. I think as well as being seen as being divisive, sometimes people see it as something rather dated. Isn't this a debate from the past we should sort of move on from? But perhaps most seriously of all, I think, given our mission as churches, we're trying to reach the lost. Well, isn't this just something of a distraction from the gospel? So that, I think, is often how this topic is perceived. The problem is it's an issue that won't go away. Certainly if you do any evangelism, science and Christianity, the creation evolution objection will keep being raised. And of course, the whole sort of evolutionary origins idea is something culturally defining for us. It's taught in primary schools, it's assumed in just everything on the telly, the media, and everything else. I mean, here's I think from a while ago, Brian Cox. Is this going to move? No. I'm trying to get, there we go. Well, look how this is described. Professor Brian Cox reveals how the most fundamental scientific principles and laws explain not only the story of the universe, but the story of us all. You see the connection it's making between this sort of story of origins and our own identity, in effect. So it's something very culturally defining. So how do we address this? Well, let me describe just a few of the sort of camps, if you like, in the sort of Christian world. First of all, young Earth creationism, which is basically where I'm coming from. It's not my preferred label because I don't think it really captures what's most central, as we'll see a bit later. But I think the key thing about this position, it is different really to all the other ones I described, in that it explicitly is in contradiction to the whole evolutionary chronology. And by that, I mean the sort of history of events and the timescale. Now, obviously, the people tends to be associated with are people like Henry Morris and Ken Ham. But I think to really understand creationism in its modern form, you need to know about the work of people like Todd Wood, Kurt Wise, John Whitmore, Leonard Brand, and many others. And I suspect many of you probably haven't heard of many, if not all, of those names. But if you haven't heard of them, I would say you don't really understand creationism. It's also worth noting that a lot of people that call themselves creationists are really at heart anti-evolutionists. That's really what defines them, what energizes them. But I don't think that is right. That young Earth creationism should be a positive position where we are wanting to understand God's world. And purely sort of anecdotally, I would say this is gaining some traction, I think, amongst the younger generation of leaders. At least that's what we would hope. That's part of our mission as an organization. Okay, old Earth creationism. Here you have miraculous creation events, but they're slotted within the evolutionary chronology. And a sort of classic proponent of this is Hugh Ross in America. His organization's Reasons to Believe has its own sort of eccentricities, I think, his version of it. But I think this is the sort of default position for many people in the church, even if it's not sort of articulated as such. I don't think it's very commonly defended in any detail, because it gets quite complicated when you start getting down to the nitty-gritty of where you actually, how you actually explain certain things in the scientific record, and theological issues and whatever. And I would argue, you can ask me about this later, that it's sort of the worst of all worlds. And a lot of the arguments I'm going to make against theistic evolution really also apply to old Earth creation. So if you like, if I wasn't a young Earth creationist, I think I would be a theistic evolutionist, not an old Earth creationist. So theistic evolution, or sometimes people prefer to call it evolutionary creation or some other sort of variation of that. Here, the sort of standard evolutionary chronology is essentially describing the creative processes of God. God is the person behind all of these things that science has revealed. And as a position, it's very much starting with the idea of no conflict. You have the book of Revelation in nature and in scripture, those are in harmony. Evolution is essentially a fact that we have to deal with. And this position really has been pervasive amongst the sort of generation of leaders post Second World War. That's quite a long time ago now, into the sort of 60s and 70s, very influenced by people like Oliver Barclay, who was the head of what's now UCCF at the time, the organization Christians in Science. A lot of the evangelical leadership that maybe we've grown up with have been very influenced by that position. And in its classic form, and this would be the sort of thing Oliver Barclay would have gone for. The Bible is inerrant, that there's not a this is, if you like, perfectly sound in its understanding of Scripture, but the issue is is how we interpret it. I think the difficulty is it starts getting exegetically quite hard to maintain that, for example, Paul didn't teach physical death came from sin. And so for that reason, there's a sort of new variant of this, people like Peter Enns and others, that are essentially saying, of course, Paul teaches that physical death came from sin, but Paul was a child of his time. He had the scientific worldview of his time. He believed in, the three-tiered universe, all that sort of thing. And that's, that's fine, but we just don't get our science from Paul. And so that's a slightly different version here of theistic evolution. Then you've got something like intelligent design, which, strictly speaking, isn't really a sort of overall position on origins. It's something that can be consistent with an old Earth, a young Earth, with different views. It is at heart simply a very rigorous scientific theory for detecting design. And as such, I think it's very helpful in providing evidence against naturalism, the idea that nature is all that there is. But because it's fundamentally a scientific theory, it's not Christian or anything else. And that is, I think, both its strength and its weakness. That's very useful in some situations, that it's not tied, if you like, to Scripture as such, but obviously that's a weakness if we're trying to defend Christianity. So it's useful. I'm very positive towards ID, but it's not the whole answer, in my view. And then finally, mere creationism. John Collins came up with this sort of idea. It's the sort of C.S. Lewisification of Christianity. If you can put mere in front of something, you'll get Lewis's approval. And the sort of objective here is to try and take some of the heat out of the topic. Let's focus on what we can agree on. It's a very sort of laudable aim. And in its best formulation, it's not so far from where I'm coming from, in that it's trying to focus on what's most central. The problem is, I think it tends to become something more akin to the sort of question of a courting couple that come to you and say, how far can we go? Almost how much can I get away with? What's the absolute minimum that I have to believe on this topic? Which I think is not quite the best question. And in the end, you can't avoid coming down on one side or another on different hard questions on, who Adam is, when he lived, and all that sort of stuff. So that's a bit of an overview of different positions. I have used all sorts of different labels for where I'm coming from. You've got some of them listed there. Adam from the beginning of creation, no agony before Adam, young fossil evolutionary fudism, all sorts of things. If you want those explained a bit, there's a podcast with there where that is all discussed as to what we call ourselves. Obviously, I'm not trying to be impartial this morning. I am paid by Biblical Creation Trust, so I'm going to be presenting a view, but obviously we have time at the end for you to come back at me and to challenge what I'm saying. And I think just two things to really note overall is that I'm trying to say Origins isn't primarily an issue of apologetics. It's actually an application of mainstream Christian theology. So it's not sort of here's this problem, here's this objection, evolution, how are we going to sort of deal with it and then get back to the gospel. Rather, if we start almost with the gospel, start with mainstream core Christian theology, what implications does that have for Origins? And if that's the way you frame the discussion, it's actually no longer a distraction from the gospel, it's actually a great way into it. And it also means you don't need to be a scientist to address this and to have something to say. So that's, if you like, the sort of first part of this, where are we? Now let's move to the sort of what's at stake. And I'm going to try and give really two examples of gospel theology that directly relate to the Origins debate that also have apologetic implications. So first of all, the cross and resurrection. I wonder if that's what you expected me to begin with. It's obviously something pretty central. And I would say that, when we come to the Origins debate, that the most important question is not dating or dinosaurs or DNA, but death. And in particular, why did Jesus have to die? Every Christian agrees the cross is the answer to the problem of sin. And we don't think that's just something random. God decides out of nowhere that he'll make the cross the answer to sin. He could have, decided something totally different. No, God doesn't act arbitrarily. Rather, there's a connection between the solution and the problem. There's a coherence, if you like, to the storyline of the Bible, the history of salvation. And for a story, for a narrative to hold together, it has to have some logical structure. So Jesus dies on the cross because the wages of sin is death. But is merely spiritual death in view? Is it that sin brings us under God's wrath? It cuts us off from eternal life in God. Is that purely the issue? Well, if that were the case, then payment for sin could have been accomplished through Jesus' suffering spiritual death on the cross, as he was forsaken by his Father in judgment on sin. He could have undergone that suffering and said, "It is finished," and come down from the cross alive, and still secured our salvation. If the wages of sin were merely spiritual death, then Jesus' physical death on the cross was something redundant. Its only purpose would be to show Jesus' humanity, that he's somehow sharing in our intrinsic mortality. It would have nothing to do with providing atonement. And obviously that would be a pretty massive revision of how the cross has been understood down the history of the church. Not least in our celebration of the Lord's Supper, we have these physical symbols of bread and wine, of a physical death, a broken body and shed blood. We can sometimes sort of over-spiritualize this. In other words, the mainstream understanding of the church down the ages is that Jesus' physical death is part of the wages of sin. And it's also explicitly said in the New Testament. Colossians 1:22, but now he has reconciled you by Christ's physical body through death. 1 Peter 2:24, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree. And so you see the sort of logic. If Jesus needed to physically die to pay the price of sin, then physical death must be the result of sin. And it's something that I think Scripture teaches, and it's really just assumed throughout the Old Testament. It's assumed in the whole sacrificial system, something has to die. Or just take this almost random example here from the life of the Israelites. They say to Samuel, pray to the Lord your God that we will not die, for we have added to our other sins the evil of asking for a king. They see somehow that sin demands death. And, the Israelites were not the sharpest theologians, yet they get this point without any difficulty. So what's that got to do with Origins? Well, evolutionary history says physical death has always been present. It's just the way the world is. It's part of nature, like gravity. The cross, I think, tells us that death is an unnatural intrusion. It's a judgment on the world that has turned away from its creator. So as Douglas Wilson put it, Adam came into the world through death, i.e. through the whole evolutionary process, or death came into the world through Adam. And if it is the case of the latter, then that means evidence of death, for example, fossils, must be after Adam. So if you like, my argument for young age comes from the cross, not from the days of Genesis. And we can make a similar argument from the resurrection. Why did Jesus have to rise from the dead? Well, look at, again, the logic that Paul uses. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of the dead comes also through a man. He's using the storyline of the Bible again. There has to be a match between the problem and the solution. And so Paul here is comparing the resurrection life that comes through Christ with the death that comes through Adam's sin. And again, this death can't merely be spiritual, because obviously the central claim of Christianity is that Jesus rose from the dead to a new physical life. The resurrection includes new physical life, and that's the solution to the physical death that came through Adam's sin. So in the resurrection, we are celebrating a victory. You know, we sing, "See what a morning, death is dead, love has won, Christ has conquered." Well, what has he conquered? Well, he's conquered physical death. The resurrection is a victory over physical death, the last enemy. But if you say that physical death has always been present, as you get in evolutionary history, then you find the sort of very center of the Christian story, the resurrection, becomes something of a contradiction. Because we find the hero Jesus comes to conquer an enemy that he made at the beginning. He made the world with death in place at the beginning, and then he comes along and conquers it. That just doesn't make a lot of sense as a story. And I think it means the coherence of the gospel unravels. So we're really comparing these two different histories of death. They are two different histories of the world. And if you try and put the sort of death always present into the Bible storyline, you start to have a problem. You have a different history of creation. And we see that in the third question here. What is the extent of the atonement? And I mean that not in the traditional sense of who did Christ die for, but does it include the physical world? Does it include creation? Does it include, for example, our bodies? Well, in a sense, we've already answered that, because if our bodies don't matter, if there's nothing wrong with our bodies, then why would we need resurrection bodies? But obviously we do need resurrection bodies. Our bodies need redemption. And this is what we find explicitly told there in Romans 8. We're looking forward to the redemption of our bodies, a salvation word. It's not simply our souls that need saving, it's whole people with bodies as well. And of course, this makes sense of Jesus's healing ministry. What's healing about? Healing is restoring function. In other words, when you're healing someone, you're saying there was something wrong that needs to be addressed, something that was not as it's meant to be. And so Jesus heals people from leprosy and blindness, paralysis, demon possession. And this is seen as part of his work of redemption. When Matthew describes what he's doing in this healing ministry, he says this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah, quoting there from Isaiah 53, he took up our infirmities and carried our diseases. The healing of disease is linked to the atonement paying the penalty of sin. In other words, disease as well as death is part of the penalty of sin. Well, of course, evolution says that disease, disability, death have always been there. But if that is how Jesus made things at the beginning, then in his healing, he's a sort of somehow like a sort of bad architect that's coming to correct the blunders in his original design, rather than a savior undoing the effects of sin. But it's more than our bodies that need redemption. The whole of creation is subject to frustration and needs liberation, as it's got there in Romans 8. Same thing in Colossians 1. All things need to be reconciled by Christ. So if creation needs reconciliation, then something must have gone wrong with creation, which, when you think about it, is one of the few things that just about everyone in the world agrees on. Something is wrong with the world. Well, we can explain that. Sin has affected the physical world beyond merely human beings. And that is an idea we find repeatedly in the Old Testament. I won't go through all of these, don't worry. Most explicitly really in the flood. Why does God send a flood? If the problem was simply human sin, why not just wipe out humans? Why a flood that destroys the rest of creation? Well, I think the answer is because we're told the earth was corrupt. Animals were violent as well as people. And the whole world is included in the flood because the whole world needs recreation. So the flood has enormous theological significance. It's telling us that God's promise of salvation is not merely for our souls. God could have whisked Noah and his family off to some heavenly spiritual existence, but he didn't. He rescues them in a boat in a physical world and renews that world. He's telling us that salvation includes our bodies and the whole of creation. And if you want that explained a bit more, there's a paper you can get on our website where I talk about that flood theology. But if you go to the evolutionary story, creation is functioning now pretty much as it always has done. There is no fall that affects creation directly. It's only indirectly through sinful activities of man. In other words, the suffering and death of creation are nothing to do with sin. This means that new creation is merely God's second attempt at creation. Second time round, he does a better job and makes a physical creation without suffering. That rather changes your view of God, I think. It's no longer a God of grace undoing the effects of our sin, but a God who at best almost seems incompetent. And it alters our view of the cross because it means the cross as payment for sin has nothing to do with new creation. The atonement only achieves our spiritual salvation. New creation is not part of that salvation. It's merely the answer to a less than ideal original creation. So I would argue accepting evolutionary history does alter our view of the cross. I think it diminishes the cross. I think it renders the resurrection incoherent, all of which obviously rather matter. And there's apologetic implications to this as well. One of the most commonly raised apologetic problems is the problem of suffering, the problem of natural evil. Stephen Fry waxes lyrical about this in this video that went viral in 2015. Why would you want to worship a God who makes a world with bone cancer or other forms of natural evil? And, like to say, our Christians, we often like to talk about the beauty in creation. We stick that on our posters and all that, but what about all the less pleasant aspects of creation? And essentially what Fry is doing is he's seeing a connection between between creation and the character of the creator. And he's absolutely right to do that. You are good and what you do is good, is what we're told in Psalm 119. God is revealed not simply in a list of attributes, but in what he does. Creation is a sort of character reference for God. But if you accept evolutionary history, that leaves you with a problem because you're saying that God made the world in the beginning, replete with danger, disease, and death. That's what he chose to do. That's what he identifies himself with. He doesn't sort of distance himself from this creation. Rather, he identifies with it, surveys this creation, and says, it seems with satisfaction, this is very good. And that, to me, makes it very hard to defend the goodness of God, which is perhaps one of the biggest hurdles in our evangelism. It's not so much does God exist, is this a God I want to know? And just, I'm not sure how much longer I've got left, but just, how am I doing, Tom?
Coming up on 20 more minutes, but...
Well, let me just introduce this, and I won't go through all of this because I want to leave plenty of time for people to come back at me. But the second area is humanity. How do we define what being human is? Scientifically, we would define this as, the species Homo sapiens, but that's obviously not something we find in the Bible. The Bible defines humanity as people made uniquely in creation as the image of God. And of course, everyone every evangelical would agree with that. And actually, most evangelicals would also insist on a historical Adam, that Adam was a real historical figure. What you find is there are different views on how Adam relates to the rest of humanity. And essentially, there are basically two approaches here. Two versions of human origins. First of all, Adam with no parents. So Adam is uniquely created. He's initially alone. Eve is also miraculously created, and everyone else is physically then descended from Adam and Eve. The second position is if you're trying to fit Adam, historical Adam, into evolutionary history. Here you have a whole population of hominin creatures who are produced by the processes of evolution, and God chooses one of those creatures to have this new spiritual status as the image of God and to represent humanity. So Adam, in this new sort of named status as the image of God, is surrounded by a population of creatures, including his parents, who are physically, emotionally, intellectually the same as him. They have all the same capabilities. It's just that Adam is made distinct by this new spiritual status conferred by God. That then has implications for how we understand who is human. How do we know all of us here on this Zoom call are the image of God? Well, in model 1, I think that's very straightforward. Humanity are the physical descendants of Adam and Eve. There's an objective basis for this. It's clear, if you like, who is in Adam. In model 2, you've got the problem of what about Eve? Adam, we're told, is the image of God. What about Eve? Does Adam marry an animal? What about Adam's parents? Remember, they are physically the same as Adam. What about people living alongside Adam? Are they sort of somehow zapped at the same time? In which case, how is Adam special? If they're zapped later, when? And how would I know? Because I don't know God's decrees. And you can see there's lots of potential for sort of abuse here and a rather arbitrary basis of who's in Adam, who's truly human. And I'll finish with this bit. What is human? Our image of Godness, I would argue, applies to our whole person, body and soul. Adam is made from the beginning of his existence as the image of God. Our bodies also image God. God says, does he who implanted the ear not hear? Does he who formed the eye not see? God is described as doing things we accomplish with our bodies. And in that sense, we image him, even though God does not have a body. So our bodies matter. But in model 2, the problem is our image of Godness is something added. It's not intrinsic to his identity. He has a body, he walks upright, he thinks, he sings, he plans, he designs tools, he makes up stories, he laughs, all before he's the image of God. Those are simply the physical capabilities he and the other hominins around have. In other words, our humanity is not something physical, it's a purely spiritual quality. In which case, why does Jesus need to be incarnated physically? Why not simply come as a spiritual image of God? And this, finally, does create a problem with transgender. Because in Genesis 1:27, the image of God is talked about in parallel with being male and female. If the image of God is something purely spiritual, then surely the same applies to our maleness and femaleness. Gender is not rooted in something physical, which of course is the very thing that transgender ideology says. So I would argue there's some pretty unhelpful implications for that second model. And I'll stop with that. I just want to point, if you're wanting to sort of, I'm obviously covering loads of stuff very quickly. If you're wanting to explore this a bit more slowly and in a bit more detail, this paper you'll find in Foundations, pretty much most of the stuff I've said here today will be in there in some form. And there's some other resources here I'll just put on the screen for you. And yeah, if you want to see how all this applies to actually preaching Genesis, you can hear some sermons I did on that, again, on the BCT website. And those sort of resources from my colleague, Paul Garner. But with that, let me stop and let's have some questions. Shall I come out of the screen sharing?
Yeah, that's probably a good idea. There's a couple of questions in the chat already.
Okay, great. Okay. Right, great. Yeah, I thought this would come up. Okay, I get the impression you don't distinguish between human and animal life. Theistic evolutionists might see animals and plants in one category, humans in the other. Was there no plant death before the fall? Yeah, okay. So there obviously is plant death before the fall. I mean, talks about, eating plants, cell death. But of course, that isn't, cell death, for example, isn't mentioned in the Bible. It's not a scientific textbook. So we've got to be very careful importing, if you like, a modern notion of death in a scientific sort of sense into the Bible. So yes, I think there's definitely a distinction between plants and the rest of life. Now, when it comes to humans and animals, even if you totally put aside the issue of animal death, I think there is a dating problem purely on the human death issue, because what are you going to count as human? Neanderthals, for example. The more we're finding out about Neanderthals is that they were pretty much just like us. There's a brilliant BBC program on this a few years ago. If you put a Neanderthal in a suit and put him on the tube, no one would really notice. And yet Neanderthals go back hundreds of thousands of years. They also interbred with Homo sapiens. So if you're saying Neanderthals are not human, well, we've got the problem that most of us on this Zoom call are descendants of interbreeding between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And, are we the fruits of bestiality? How does that work spiritually? If Homo sapiens are somehow the sort of spiritual ones, what's the status of these people that are sort of half animal, half human? That's a real problem, I think. But you can go back even further. What about Homo erectus? The more evidence we find about this early creatures is that, they were making shelters, they were cooking with fire, they were traveling across open water. That takes a lot of planning and thought. So on what basis are you saying they are not human? But if you're saying that they are human, and if humanity is descendants of Adam and Eve, you're going to have to put Adam millions of years ago. And I think that is a bit of a problem in reconciling that with the biblical chronologies. So to me, I could explain that more, but essentially, that there is a problem with dating, even if you're just saying human death comes from sin. But just very quickly, I don't think it's simply human death. I think that's actually very hard to maintain a sort of distinction there, because, for example, what about all those other hominids that are very similar to human beings? Why is disease and suffering in them something fine, but not in Adam? And I think there's actually a lot of explicit evidence that animal death and suffering does come from human sin, not least in the account of the flood. All flesh are destroyed. That isn't, in the NIV, it comes as all humans. It's actually all flesh, and that's defined in the text as including animals. The Passover includes animals as well as human beings. We ignore all this stuff about animals in the Bible, but there's stacks of it. The animal death is included with the humans. So I would argue there's a strong case for animal death being included too, but I'll stop on that one. Okay, you mentioned characters such as Todd Wood, who works with Paul Garner. Do you want to say something about his views? Well, I think it's probably best he speaks for himself about his views. You can read his blog. You can, there's a podcast that Paul does with Todd that's a great resource for exploring these sort of topics in a sort of fairly sort of chatty, informal way. I don't know if the questioner wants to sort of explain more what you're sort of getting at on that, is whether you think Todd Wood is saying stuff that is unhelpful or whatever. So
can I just elaborate on that, Stephen? Todd has been quoted in various places as being, what should I say, saying that there is much evidence for evolution.
Yep.
And some people have expressed disquiet about his views. I just wanted your views on that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I would essentially, I mean, Todd knows more about this than I do. I mean, I would essentially agree. And that may sound strange, but not everything that evolutionists say is wrong. There is, I mean, the part of the reason evolutionists believe this stuff is because it seems to explain certain evidence, and it does seem to explain, you know, some of the evidence of similarity and other stuff, you know, really well. You can see patterns and things. But if you understand how science works, the fact that there is evidence for a position does not mean it's correct. You're having to look at the whole you know, the whole sweep of evidence, the whole sweep of things you're trying to explain. So I don't see it as, I think it's a problem actually when Christians come across as saying that somehow evolutionists are stupid, or that there's no, you know, you sometimes get this in books, you know, that there is no evidence for evolution. Well, that is actually, I think, just a very stupid thing to say. And, you know, if people go off and study this sort of thing more, they, you know, come across stuff and think, well, actually, that does seem to fit pretty well with evolution. You know, what was this stuff I was taught before? So we shouldn't be afraid of saying that. There is evidence for it, but there's evidence for lots of things. It doesn't mean that it's a correct overall model.
Anyone, do feel free to come back on stuff or ask new questions, chat, or just unmute. Facian.
Hi, thank you, Stephen, for that. Could you say anything about your views on Genesis 1 then? Because how does that link to the origins question?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm partly trying to reframe the debate by, in effect, saying that we can derive all of this just from the New Testament. You know, so these people that say, "Oh, I can't comment on the origins issue. I'm not an Old Testament expert," is irrelevant. It's essentially a New Testament issue. Now, obviously, I think part of the reason the New Testament says all this is because that's what's taught there in Genesis. So, I'm trying to think where to sort of go on this. I mean, Genesis 1, the whole of Genesis, in fact, the whole of the Bible is stuffed full of literary devices and structure. The Gospels are. Everything is. So this argument that somehow, oh, there's a literary structure here, therefore this isn't historical, is actually utter nonsense if you try and apply that anywhere else in the Bible. Or that somehow we can't really have any idea of what this is sort of saying at all. So there's plenty of literary structure, but I mean, you can have a poem that is describing historical events. You get that in the Psalms all the time. So I don't have a problem with literary structure. To me, the way the days are defined in the passage, there's morning and evening, this pattern of first, second, third, fourth, the way it's spoken of in Exodus, and probably a part of other arguments I can't remember now, all seem to, you know, point to the fact that these are sort of normal days. But in the end, that is you know, how we interpret one chapter, one word, and that, if you like, is going to have a little bit more uncertainty than some of these bigger theological themes I've tried to focus on. So I would be, if you like, a, you know, six-day creationist, if you want to use that sort of terminology, but it's not where I would begin, because it's not what's most central. But I do think it's actually pretty clear.
Thanks, Stephen. It's been really stimulating. Can I just come back on one of the answers that you gave just a couple of minutes ago? Are you saying that you don't think Neanderthal, Homo erectus existed, or that they did but not in the time frame, that they are human? I couldn't quite pick up what you were saying from your answer.
Great. Yeah, no, great question. Yeah, I mean, there's a pile of other slides I could start showing here, but no, I absolutely believe they exist. I mean, sometimes I think people sort of think, oh, these are just all inventions or something. You know, they've heard of Piltdown Man, which was a fraud, and somehow all these other things, that's nonsense. These are real fossils of real people. And I would argue that certainly Neanderthals and also Homo erectus was actually fully human like us, the image of God. You could have evangelized them, and they're descendants of Adam. So if you're sort of looking at all those fossils and saying, well, which one was Adam, you're missing the point, because these fossils are all appearing in what I would see as rocks that are there after the flood. So what we're actually looking at is not Adam, but Noah's descendants. So after the flood, there was, the animals spread out, first of all. That's why we see them, at least a lot of the geological column is stuff in the flood, but then after the flood, you've got the sort of mammals and stuff like that, and you see them spreading out over the world. And then at the top, you've got these hominin fossils. And there seems to be a much greater variety of sort of types of humans then than now. So they were all fully human, descendants of Adam, descendants in the end of Noah, and very intelligent. This idea all these are sort of primitive men, is nonsense. It was hard to live after the flood. You had all sorts of continuing disasters and stuff. You didn't have time to sort of have too much culture and everything, but they were perfectly intelligent. And we start seeing that, I think, in some of the sort of ancient civilization and language and stuff. So yeah, they were real.
Thank you.
Okay, to ask another question.
Thank you.
Have you ever heard anyone say that the image of God is only spiritual? The image of God in people is only a spiritual thing and not in our bodies?
Yes.
Because I don't think I've come across that view, and you seem to be engaging with that rather than a mainstream theistic evolution view.
Well, that is pretty much what Dennis Alexander is arguing for, because it's this new spiritual status as Adam is brought into this relationship with God. That is what he's arguing for. There's some confusing way I think he uses the language, but to me that is the position he's arguing. Ironically, I think even potentially someone like Calvin, I think, underplayed the sort of physicality of the image of God. I think there is actually a interesting theological argument there as to quite how that has been understood down the years, but that's a bit separate from this debate over evolution. So there are lots of nuances in this, but when you push back as to where people are drawing the lines and what they mean by being the image of God and everything else, and what it means to be human, who can potentially be saved, then I think I am being accurate in what I'm describing. But it's the sort of thing everyone says, of course, all humanity is the image of God. I'm saying, but how do you know that? What's your basis for saying that? How do you know that this person next to me is the image of God? If it's not based on something objective like physical descent, then to me it's become something a bit arbitrary. Mike Reeves argues this in his, you find it on the internet. It's also a chapter in the book IVP did on evolution a few years ago, but he talks about this very issue.
Stephen, I was wondering if you could comment a bit on the kind of science that you're involved in and your kind of colleagues are involved in, because I guess I think I've read elsewhere you kind of talking about science that's done under this paradigm of looking at the possibility or the hypothesis of young Earth, and sometimes it sounds like everyone's saying, oh well, no one's doing science like this, so we haven't got very far. And sometimes it feels like you can't really push it down the line forever. So I just wondered whether there's kind of any traction in that movement, whether there's stuff that's coming out that is even listened to by more kind of mainstream science. Maybe that's two questions in there.
Yeah, a good place to start exploring this would be Paul Garner's book, The New Creationism. And actually also that new book has just come out, Fossils and the Flood. This is more expensive, but it's full of amazing illustrations. That's really giving a just find one of the pages. It's all showing back to front, but a sort of reconstruction of the pre-flood world and all that sort of thing. And that is based on creationist research. I mean, it's one of these things where people can always say, oh, but what about? Because there's always more for you to explore. But where creationists have attacked certain problems seriously, it could have gone two ways. It could have gone the way of actually it just ends up creating more and more problems. But actually what has happened is the other way around. Actually, no, there's some answers here. So, I mean, just an example of some of the work that Paul Garner was doing on the Coconino sandstone in the Grand Canyon, which is something that's very extensive in America and probably in other parts of the world too. And the classic geologists will say, oh, that was deposited as a desert sand. And they base this on the work of someone, an eminent geologist back in the 1930s, I think. And that's a bit of a problem because you're saying that this desert sand is in the middle of a whole pile of rocks. You're saying are flood rocks, you know, so it seems like a bit of a defeater to sort of your whole flood geology idea. And so they started to investigate this and actually look at this rock, and multiple lines of evidence where actually McKee just got a whole load of things wrong. I mean, he was a perfectly good geologist, but he literally measured the angles wrong on some of this stuff. When you look at the minerals that are present, they're water deposited minerals, and lots of other arguments like this that actually show this was a water deposited sand. So, you know, all this fact, this is the desert sand. Well, actually, let's go and do some work and examine this. Well, actually, it wasn't. And this stuff, some of this stuff has been published in secular journals. It's been presented at the Geological Society of America. People were intrigued by this. In a sense, they'll sort of acknowledge, yeah, okay, your work's right there, but, you know, what about, or, you know, all this other stuff you've also got to explain. So that's an example of taking on a particular problem that, you know, within a creationist framework. And there's lots of other examples like that, where you know, there is serious work being done. There's another, find this booklet here too, the 99% Missing, Where on Earth Did All the Time Go, which addresses some of the sort of dating issues that when you look at the geological column, you know, conventional geologists will argue that, you know, certain rock formations were deposited very quickly. The evidence within the rocks themselves shows you that. But then because of radiometric dating, there must have been vast time gaps between, you know, this rock layer you've got here and another rock layer you've got further up. The problem is you don't see evidence for those vast time gaps. It is this sort of 99% missing. And so, if you like, there's geological evidence in the field that is making you question the way that the validity of the sort of radiometric dates. Now, that still leaves you with the question of how do you explain the radiometric dates, but it's showing that there is, that the problems aren't all one way, if you like. There are some real problems for conventional geology with their sort of long age framework. So, yeah, I mean, it's a whole other talk, and get Paul along to talk about this. But to me, there is real science here done by people that are experts in the fields that they are investigating, which hasn't always been the case in creationism down the centuries or down the decades.
Quick one, perhaps, if there's still time.
Yeah, one more.
What's your take on a film like Is Genesis History? Would you recommend that? Would you agree with most of it, or?
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful resource. Yeah, I think of all the sort of creationist sort of films, that's probably one of the best, or the best. I mean, it's interviewing people that know what they're talking about, and there's lots of other supplementary material. So I think it is a good way in actually to understand something of the creation worldview. I think in a funny sort of way, I think the bit that was probably the weakest was almost the bit at the end on the sort of theological side. I think everyone thinks the problems are all on the science, but actually I think there's plenty of work to be done on the, you know, how we put the Bible together in this sort of framework. So yeah, I think it is a good resource, and it'd be an excellent thing to recommend. Yeah.
Great, thank you everyone for those questions, and thank you Stephen for joining us. Perhaps you could just say, Stephen, you mentioned some books on the science that the new creationism has done. books on the kind of on the theological issues, if people want to take it further?
Well, to be honest, that is what is massively lacking. You'll find loads of books, talking about why we need to understand the days as 24-hour days or something. But in terms of the sort of theology of this, there isn't a lot, which is really part of my mission, I suppose, is to try and address that. So, I mean, that book or that paper in Foundations, we've also sort of published as a little booklet, but it's the same text. So you can just get it there from the Foundations website. Is probably the best way in. There's a chapter in the book, sorry, let's get this one here, Debating Darwin, that from 2009. I do a chapter in there that, again, is a similar sort of theological approach. But there is a work in progress that I'm probably not allowed to say much more than that, but that will be quite a major contribution on this, with multiple authors and perhaps some authors you wouldn't quite expect as well, part of it, that will be very much addressing the whole different aspects of the theology of all of this. Yeah, so that is a real deficiency.
Mike Reeves has done some stuff, right? I mean,
yes, yeah. I mean, sorry, that's
that one, that one.
Yeah, that's a helpful. That's great. Yeah, Mike, Adam the Fall, Original Sin, and that paper I mentioned. I think it's on the Reformation 21 website on Adam and Eve. If you just search that for Mike Reeves, it should come up. That's a helpful thing on that. Yeah.
And that's I was glad you mentioned that Debating Darwin book, where Stephen's got a chapter interacting with some others coming from the other perspective, and then with responses. So that's a very helpful resource to get interaction.
I mean, it's a slightly sort of unsatisfactory resource in that the person arguing the science on that, purportedly from sort of my side, is really taking quite a different view to me. But anyway, that's just how it was put together. So yeah.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Stephen. That's been ThinkFor50 this time. I've got a number of people lined up for our next sessions, but struggling to pin it.